Some evenings arrive gently, almost politely, as if they do not want to disturb what is already fragile. The air feels calm, the lights are warm, and the silence pretends to be peace. But silence can be deceptive. It can hide everything that has been breaking quietly for years. Natalie stood in front of the mirror in the bedroom, her fingers lightly pressing the fabric of her dress, smoothing imaginary wrinkles that no one else would notice. The dress was pale blue, simple, neither bold nor dull. She had chosen it carefully, the same way she chose everything now. Nothing too bright. Nothing that would draw attention. Nothing that could possibly invite criticism. She studied her reflection, not searching for beauty, but for permission. Permission to exist in the space she occupied. Permission to be seen without being judged. Her face looked composed, almost serene, but her eyes carried a tired depth, the kind that comes from learning to swallow words before they ever reach the tongue. 5 years of marriage had taught her this skill well. Behind her, the bedroom door remained open. She could hear Richard downstairs, the sharp sound of his shoes against the marble floor, the impatient rhythm of someone who believed the world should move at his pace. Richard never waited. Waiting to him was a weakness. She took one last look at herself and whispered, almost unconsciously, "It's fine." She wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. Downstairs, Richard checked his watch. When Natalie appeared at the top of the stairs, he glanced up briefly, his eyes scanning her the way one might inspect an object before purchase. No warmth followed. "We're late," he said, adjusting his jacket. No greeting. No acknowledgement beyond the statement. "I know," Natalie replied softly. The drive to the event passed in silence, broken only by the sound of traffic and the faint hum of the city outside. Natalie watched the lights blur past the window, her reflection flickering faintly in the glass. Richard focused on the road, jaw tight. Mind already inside the room they were about to enter. The event was a formal gathering hosted in a grand hall filled with polished floors. Crystal glasses and voices trained to sound confident even when they weren't. People moved in clusters, laughter rising and falling like waves, each group orbiting around opportunity. Richard stepped into the room as if he'd belonged there, shoulders squared, expression assured. Natalie followed him instinctively, a step behind, the invisible distance she had learned to maintain. She smiled when someone looked at her, nodded politely, retreated into herself when conversations turned sharp or competitive. People greeted Richard warmly. Hands were shaken. Compliments were exchanged. Deals were hinted at with half-smiles and raised eyebrows. Natalie stood quietly at his side, her presence acknowledged only when necessary. Someone asked Richard how long they had been married. 5 years. He replied without looking at her. Natalie smiled faintly. Another guest glanced at her and said, "You must be very proud of him." Natalie opened her mouth to respond, but Richard answered first. "She's used to it," he said lightly. "I keep her busy." Few people laughed. Natalie's smile froze, then softened again, as if nothing had happened. She told herself it didn't matter. She told herself she was being sensitive. She had told herself that for years, as the evening progressed. Natalie found herself standing near a table of appetizers, pretending to examine them while listening to conversations drift past her. She felt invisible, but invisibility had become familiar, almost comfortable in a painful way. Then a woman approached her, older, with kind eyes and a gentle confidence that did not demand attention. "Hello," the woman said. "I've seen you standing alone for a while. These events can be exhausting." Natalie smiled, surprised. "Yes, they can be. I'm glad you came," the woman continued. "It's nice to see someone who doesn't feel the need to perform." The words caught Natalie off guard. "Thank you," she said. "That's kind of you." They spoke briefly about the event, about work, about small things that felt large simply because they were spoken with sincerity. The woman asked Natalie what she did. "I used to work in project coordination," Natalie said carefully. "I took a break," the woman nodded thoughtfully. "That kind of work requires intelligence and patience. Both are undervalued." Natalie felt a warmth spread through her chest. It had been so long since anyone spoke to her like that without judgment or expectation. Richard noticed them talking. He approached, smile already in place. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone polite but sharp beneath the surface. "We were just talking," the woman said. "Your wife is very thoughtful." Richard laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "Thoughtful," he repeated. "She overthinks. That's her real talent." The woman's smile faltered. Natalie felt her throat tighten, but she stayed quiet. Richard leaned closer, lowering his voice slightly. "Though not enough, don't encourage her too much," he added. "She tends to forget her place." The words stung more than she expected, not because they were loud, but because they were familiar. The woman excused herself politely, casting Natalie a sympathetic glance before leaving. Richard turned back to Natalie, irritation clear in his eyes. "Why do you always look like you're waiting for praise?" he asked. "It's embarrassing." Natalie swallowed. "I wasn't." "Then don't act like it," he said, already turning away. She stood there, frozen, the noise of the room suddenly distant. Something inside her shifted, not violently, but deeply. It was the quiet realization that she had been shrinking herself for someone who had never once tried to meet her halfway. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. Laughter that didn't reach her. Conversations that felt hollow. The echo of Richard's words repeating in her mind on the drive home. The silence felt heavier than before, inside the house. Richard removed his jacket and loosened his tie. "Don't make things awkward next time," he said casually. Natalie looked at him. Really looked at him, and felt something new settle in her chest. Clarity that night. She lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling while his breathing deepened into sleep. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She simply felt done. The next morning, after Richard left for work, Natalie sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee she barely tasted. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating dust particles in the air. She felt like she was seeing her surroundings for the first time. She walked into the spare room and opened the closet. Inside was an old box she hadn't touched in years. She pulled it out and sat on the floor. Inside were notebooks, documents, a laptop wrapped carefully in cloth. Pieces of a life she had paused. She opened the laptop. It took longer than she remembered to start. When it did, files appeared on the screen, familiar and comforting. Project outlines, notes, ideas. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She hesitated and began. Updating her resume felt strange, like introducing herself to herself again. She remembered things she had forgotten, skills she had buried, confidence she had surrendered. She worked slowly, carefully, afraid that moving too fast might break the fragile resolve forming inside her. When Richard returned that evening, he noticed she was quieter than usual. "You okay?" he asked, distracted. Double quotes. "Yes," Natalie replied. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't say it to keep the peace. She said it because she was beginning to believe it might become true. That night, as she closed her laptop, an email notification appeared. Not an offer. Just a response. An acknowledgement. Her heart raced. It was small, but it was real. Natalie leaned back in her chair, exhaling slowly. She didn't know where this path would lead. She only knew she had taken the first step away from a life where her worth was constantly questioned. And Richard, asleep in the next room, had no idea that the woman he thought he controlled had already begun to reclaim herself. Quietly, deliberately, and without asking for permission. The days that followed did not announce themselves as important. They looked ordinary on the surface, stitched together by routine and quiet hours. Yet beneath that calm rhythm, something fundamental was changing inside Natalie. She began waking earlier, not because she had to, but because her mind no longer felt heavy with dread. Mornings used to feel like walls she had to climb. Now they felt like open doors she hadn't yet decided to walk through, but knew were there. She worked at the small desk by the window, sunlight warming the surface as she typed. The first few assignments she received were modest, nothing glamorous, but they were hers. Each completed task felt like a brick laid carefully under her feet, forming a path forward. She rediscovered the satisfaction of problem-solving, the quiet joy of organizing chaos, the confidence that came from being trusted. Richard noticed the change. Though he couldn't name it, she spoke less at dinner, but when she did, her words were steady. She no longer rushed to fill silences. She no longer laughed at jokes that cut too close. It unsettled him. One evening he glanced at her laptop and asked, "Are you still playing around with that?" "I'm working," Natalie replied calmly. He scoffed. "For how long?" "As long as it takes." The answer lingered in the air between them, firm and unyielding. Richard frowned, unused to responses that didn't bend around his expectations. As weeks passed, Natalie's work expanded. One project led to another. Her name began appearing in email threads she wasn't copied on before. People asked her opinions and waited for her answers. It was during a virtual meeting that she first met Daniel. His camera flickered on, revealing a man with a thoughtful expression and calm presence. He didn't dominate the conversation. He listened. When he spoke, it was with clarity and respect. When Natalie presented her ideas, he nodded, asked questions that showed he had paid attention, and built on her points rather than dismissing them. After the meeting, he sent her a brief message. "Your approach was sharp and practical. I'd like to collaborate on the next phase if you're open to it." She read the message twice, then a third time. "Yes," she replied, heart pounding. "I'd like that." Their collaboration was professional, focused, and refreshingly equal. Daniel never spoke over her. He credited her contributions openly. He didn't assume authority. Instead, he treated competence as something shared, not owned. Natalie found herself looking forward to their meetings, not because of romance, but because she felt seen, valued, respected. She didn't talk about Richard. Daniel didn't ask. Meanwhile, Richard's irritation grew sharper. He noticed Natalie dressing differently. Still simple, but with intention. She no longer asked his opinion. She no longer checked his reactions. "You're out late again," he said one night. "I had a meeting," she replied. "With who?" "Colleagues." He watched her carefully. Something in his chest tightened. A sensation he wasn't used to. Uncertainty. One evening, followed her words back to their source. He attended a professional networking event unannounced. Drawn by a restless suspicion he couldn't shake, the room was smaller than the grand halls he preferred. But filled with focused conversation, he saw Natalie across the room. She was speaking. Not quietly, not nervously. She was explaining something with confidence, hands moving slightly as she made her point. People listened, and then he saw Daniel. Daniel stood beside her, attentive, not interrupting. When she finished speaking, he smiled and added to her point, crediting her directly. As Natalie mentioned, said. Richard felt something snap inside him. This was not the woman he had dismissed. This was not the shadow he had grown accustomed to ignoring. When Natalie noticed Richard, surprise flickered across her face, then faded into calm. "I didn't know you'd be here," she said. "Neither did I," Richard replied stiffly. Daniel extended his hand politely. "I'm Daniel. We're working together." Shart shook his hand, grip tight, jaw clenched. "I'm her husband." Daniel nodded. "She speaks very highly of the work you do." Natalie didn't correct him. She didn't need to. Throughout the evening, Richard watched interactions he couldn't control. People respected Natalie. They sought her input. They engaged with her ideas. When they returned home, the silence felt dangerous. "You embarrassed me," Richard finally said. Natalie turned toward him. "How? The way you acted. Like you didn't need me." She held his gaze. "I don't." The words landed softly, but their impact was undeniable. Richard laughed bitterly. "Don't fool yourself. This confidence is temporary." Natalie didn't argue. She had learned something important. Arguing required belief that the other person might listen. She no longer held that belief. Over the next few weeks, Richard tried different approaches. Sarcasm, charm, guilt, none worked. Natalie remained steady, focused, distant. Daniel noticed the shift too. During one meeting, he paused and asked gently, "Are you okay?" Natalie hesitated, then nodded. "I'm more than I've been in a long time," he smiled, not prying further. Their connection deepened, not through dramatic gestures, but through shared respect and quiet understanding. It wasn't an escape. It was a reflection of what Natalie had already begun to rebuild within herself. Richard, meanwhile, felt his grip slipping. He criticized more harshly, then softened abruptly. He mocked, then apologized. The unpredictability revealed desperation rather than strength. One night, after a tense dinner, he finally said it. "You think someone like him wants you?" He sneered. "He'll get bored. They always do." Natalie looked at him calmly. "This has nothing to do with him." "Then what does it have to do with?" Richard demanded. "With me remembering who I was before I forgot myself." The room fell silent for the first time. Richard had no response. Natalie retreated to the spare room that night, not out of fear, but out of clarity. She closed the door gently behind her and sat on the bed, breathing deeply. She wasn't running toward someone else. She was walking back to herself, and Richard, left alone in the quiet house, finally felt what Natalie had lived with for years: irrelevance. The moment Natalie realized she no longer feared Richard was not dramatic. It arrived quietly, like a truth she had always known, but had finally accepted. Fear had once shaped her choices, softened her voice, and narrowed her world. Now it had lost its grip, replaced by something steadier and far stronger. She moved through her days with intention. Work no longer felt like an escape, but a foundation. Each project sharpened her confidence, not because she was proving something to others, but because she was proving something to herself. She was capable. She was thoughtful. She was enough. Richard sensed the distance growing wider. It was no longer silence that unsettled him, but her calm. Anger he could fight. Tears he could dismiss. Calm made him invisible. He tried once more to pull her back into the old rhythm. One evening, he cooked dinner. It was awkward, poorly timed, and heavy with unspoken desperation. He poured wine, attempted conversation, and even apologized. Though the apology sounded rehearsed, "I didn't realize how unhappy you were," he said. Natalie listened. Not with hope, but with clarity. "That's because you never asked," she replied gently. He frowned. "I'm asking now." She shook her head slowly. "You're noticing now." The difference mattered. Richard leaned back in his chair, frustration creeping in. "So what now? You leave? You throw everything away because you suddenly feel empowered?" She met his gaze without anger. "I'm not throwing anything away. I'm choosing myself." The words did not come from bitterness. They came from truth. That night, Natalie packed her things. She did it methodically, folding clothes carefully, pausing when memories surfaced, then letting them pass. She wasn't erasing her past. She was releasing it. Richard stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Disbelief etched across his face. "You'll regret this," he said, his voice sharp but hollow. Natalie zipped the suitcase and looked at him. "I already regret staying when I knew I was disappearing." He had no response. She walked out with quiet dignity, not slamming the door, not looking back. The house felt lighter the moment she stepped outside, as if it, too, had been holding its breath. Her new apartment was small, modest, imperfect, but it was hers. Sunlight streamed through the windows in the morning, and the silence felt peaceful rather than heavy. She filled the space slowly, intentionally, choosing what stayed and what didn't. Daniel offered help, but never pressure. He listened when she spoke. He respected her boundaries. He admired her strength without claiming ownership of it. Their relationship unfolded naturally. Conversations grew deeper. Laughter came easier. There was no rush, no need to define things too quickly. It wasn't about filling a void. It was about sharing space one evening as they walked through a quiet street. Daniel stopped and looked at her. "You know," he said, "you didn't need anyone to see your worth. You were already carrying it." Natalie smiled softly. "I know." I just forgot for a while." Months passed. Richard's world shifted in ways he didn't expect. The admiration he once relied on felt shallow now. The house echoed. The silence he had imposed on Natalie now surrounded him. He tried dating. It felt empty. He tried distraction. It faded quickly. For the first time, he was forced to sit with himself, and in that stillness, he saw the truth. He had mistaken control for strength, dismissal for power. He had believed that diminishing someone else made him larger. Instead, it had left him smaller, alone, and deeply unfulfilled. He reached out once, a message, brief, uncertain. Natalie read it and felt no anger, no satisfaction. Only closure. She didn't reply, not because she wanted to punish him, but because she no longer needed anything from him. Her life moved forward with intention. Her work expanded. Her confidence deepened. She began mentoring others quietly, offering the kindness she once needed. One afternoon, she stood in front of a mirror again, but this time, she wasn't asking for permission. She saw a woman who had endured, learned, and grown. A woman who had reclaimed her voice without raising it. A woman who understood that love does not belittle and respect does not wound. The story didn't end with revenge. It ended with peace, and that peace was earned. Not through someone else's desire, but through her own awakening. She had learned the most important truth of all. Worth does not come from being wanted. It comes from knowing you never needed to beg to be seen.